Welcome to Emergence Magazine's podcast. I'm Emmanuel Vaughn Lee, host of this show and executive editor of Emergence Magazine, located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok people in present-day Marin County. Each week, we feature interviews, stories, poetry, and author-narrated essays exploring the threads connecting ecology, culture, and spirituality. This week, online, we're featuring Breathing with the Forest, an online adaptation of Marshmallow Laser Feast's large-scale audio and video installation that premiered at our 2023 London exhibition, Shifting Landscapes. The experience invites you into a sense of deep continuity with the Colombian Amazon rainforest and the hidden connections we share with the Kapanuri tree and the biosphere that surrounds it. As a companion to this, we're also resharing a conversation from the exhibition I had with Marshmallow Laser Feast director Ersin Han Ersin about the importance of imagination in making visible the often invisible threads that bind us together with the living world. Ersin talks about the art collective's work in creating spaces where people can step into deliberate acts of connection with the more than human that can be celebratory, but also offering a reminder of what is at risk in the midst of our ecological crisis. At the core of much of Marshmallow Laser Feast's work is the question of how can we allow ourselves to embody other beings, other species, by playing with the plasticity of our perception. We also spoke about the power of experiential art to broaden our empathy for what lies beyond the borders of the human, inviting us to open to an experience of what it's like to be part of the forest. Nice to see everyone here. My name is Emmanuel Vaughn Lee. I am the executive editor of Emergence Magazine and the curator of this show. And I'm delighted this morning to be joined by creative director of Marshmallow Laser Feast, Ersin Han Ersin, who is going to be joining us in conversation this morning. So please welcome Ersin.
Thank you.
Ersin is a multidisciplinary artist and the creative director of Marshmallow Laser Feast, the experiential art collective that we have partnered with to create The Breathing Forest, the installation that is just across the hall in this exhibition. Ersin and MLF's work have been presented at Sundance Film Festival, Tribeca Film Festival, South by Southwest Film Festival, and exhibited at esteemed institutions and galleries worldwide, including ACMI, the Barbican, Saatchi Gallery, Phi Center, DBB Seoul, Next Museum, and the Nobel Prize Museum, among others. If you're not familiar with Marshmallow Laser Feast, they are an experiential art collective whose work reinterprets the idea of human perception and experience, employing a wealth of creative disciplines and underpinned by research, inviting participants to navigate with a sensory perception beyond the everyday. In collaboration with artists, scientists, musicians, poets, programmers, engineers, and many more makers, Marshmallow Laser Feast has been leaving a slug trail of sensory experiences as they journey through the cosmos. Fusing architectural tools, contemporary imaging techniques, and performance with tactile forms, they sculpt spaces that lay dormant until animated by playful investigation. I want to start by talking about the relationship between science and imagination, Ersin, because your work sits at this intersection of science, art, and technology. And it seems that a big part of what you do is you take a scientific phenomenon and build a narrative around it, and then generate an experience of this phenomenon. But it's not purely a scientific experience, it's also a very lyrical, a poetic one, and of course an artistic one that activates the imagination and creates wonder and awe. And while your work is very much grounded in science, it seems that imagination also plays a huge part in bringing us into these spaces you create that are largely unknowable in the everyday. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you approach this intersection of science and imagination.
Sure, thank you. It's also glittery slug trails. of sensory experiences as a correction. The immediate thought when I think about how we engage with science and combine arts or collapse these two worlds, the first thought, I'm sure you've all saw the gravitational waves revealed in 2016, and they won the Nobel Prize in astrophysics or physics, and it was an incredible accomplishment, human ingenuity. This is like 100 years prior. Einstein imagines something, theoretizes, working as a collective for 100 years, and then finally finding it. Now we can, confirm that the black holes exist and they produce these gravitational waves. But the only image we had of a gravitational wave or a black hole was produced by an artist in 1970s, continuously used by NASA in order to communicate what this phenomena is. So when I look at this image, and then the beautiful thing is, the final images is just a higher resolution of what that artist imagined, informed by the phenomena, the theory. So I think our exploration into the world beyond the human senses, which is really intriguing and interesting, and these are very simple things, such as our invisible connection with the plants and trees through respiration. When we think about this phenomena, this is GCSE level science. Obviously, we all learned when we were 7 or 8, but this idea of actually visualizing, seeing that bond is fast, because our human perception is extremely limited. We construct the reality as a best guess of our cognition. Combining number of different sensory inputs, we've got a best guess of every second and but very limited when we think about, we are just seeing RGB, the red, green, blues, but there's a whole other spectrum of light outside that's defining and dictating the physics and how things function in this planet and in the galaxy. So being able to tap into that world starts for us with understanding the scientific phenomena, because that's a creative inquiry by itself. I think the scientists, the visionaries, the pioneers, they are the creative individuals looking at the future, looking at the invisible, looking at the hidden, coming up with a theory and trying to prove it. That becomes a global truth. Well, closest thing to truth, let's say, until it's proven otherwise. So, and that is our inspiration, basically, using the scientific phenomena and looking at different forms of what are the invisible elements around us, and how can we use technologies and experiential art, or art in general, to make them visible, make them tangible, create a feeling space where we can relate to things. Just, 2 examples. One is, again, the black holes. When they first found it, it was this description. I think 23 and 32 sun-sized black holes merged. I was like, what that even mean? It's like, how big is this? How can I relate to this idea of 27 sun-sized objects coming together, creating a mega mass? So I think that idea of relating to it, or a sequoia tree that takes 1,200 liters water a day from roots all the way to the canopy daily, creating these amazing clouds. They are the weather makers, contributing to the world's atmosphere in such intimate and cyclical way. How do we visualize that? How can we relate to this very cold fact? When we just talk about the amount of liters of water that goes up there, it's very much like a plumbing job. But putting emotion into this and inspiring by the scientific inquiry, which gives us the starting point, and then turning that into an experiential piece where we can relate to this idea. What would it feel like to be that drop of water, to travel from the roots all the way to the canopy and being sprayed into the atmosphere with all the other particles around you? So I think that's kind of the template that we've been following for a while, inspired by that scientific inquiry, and then finding methods and techniques to bring them into a feeling space in the form of different mediums, but often art.
You spoke about making the invisible visible, and that's obviously a big theme in your work. And breathing with the forest it makes the invisible visible. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the trajectory of that aspect of your work and how that is part of the inspiration behind the piece Breathing with the Force that's premiering here at the exhibition.
Sure. I'm going to roll back quickly to In the Eyes of the Animal, which was our very first work that we established this template of working with researchers, scientists to inform, to inspire ourselves, and then turn them into experiences or experiential art. And that project was about disembodying your own body and embodying the sensory perception of 4 different forest species: a mosquito, a dragonfly, a frog, and an owl. Looking at how they perceive the world, what color spectrum they see, how they sense their surroundings using their entire body, how they can communicate with each other just using the waves of water as they touch. These incredible phenomena happens all around us. And an owl can read newspaper from 100 meters. How would you relate to this feeling? I don't know which newspaper they love most, but so that was quite an interesting learning process for us, just looking at the Grizedale forest up in the UK, up north in the UK, and then and being able to visualize and relate to those feelings. And obviously, we're never gonna know exactly what it's like to be a dragonfly, but if we can allow ourselves to disembody our own perception for a moment, we can probably empathize better. And once you have that feeling, aided by technology, next time when you see a dragonfly, you've got a different relationship with the dragonfly. So that kind of laid the groundwork. This was 2015, and became the template. And obviously, looking at the animals and the forest creatures, we just realized trees are alive. Very, very late realization for a person, more than 30 years old. It's like, all right, this is incredible. And then the same inquiry led us to different places, and we ended up in Sequoia National Park, facing with one of those giants. It's just, your self-centered world idea completely disappears, collapses, and you just in awe. The astronauts describe this phenomena of looking at the blue dot from the space as overview effect. Once you see the entirety of Earth in one place as a single object, that unified everything you know, everything you ever know, everything you loved, everything you lost is in one place. There's this, very profound moment. Obviously, we can't all go to the space to have that feeling. It was very similar feeling standing in front of one of those giant sequoias, where it's a biological overview kicked in, and I'm nothing next to you. You can live for 2,500 years. So, and then looking at the kind of scientific understanding or taxonomic understanding of the sequoias, how do they live this long? How they, even this idea of taking water from roots to 100 meters. This is like -9 gravity. It's an extreme plumbing job. We couldn't do without using bulbs in a normal apartment block. So how do they even do this? So looking into that part, those are the invisible elements that is beyond human perception, even mostly or partially beyond our instruments or the best instruments to date to fully understand, because there is no way, and X-raying a tree that way. So just completely mind blown by some of those facts, and then bringing them into this feeling space. Continued, and in 2020 we had the opportunity to go to Amazonian rainforest for a commission to find some of the emergent trees, and Ceiba pentandras, Capinuris. Those are the largest beings in the tropics, and it just started this process of looking at incredible beings of the Amazon. Somehow relating to them, or finding ways to relate to them, because there is this National Geographic way of looking at the tropics. This lush green worlds distant from you with really interesting creatures, but you're never going to touch it, you're never going to know. When they say we're going to lose Amazon, you can't really fully comprehend what that means. And beyond that, obviously we've got the plant blindness, they call it, on radical botany, saying because plants and trees don't exhibit the animism like animals do, we've got this mental block or cognitive block to feel the same emotional response towards them. So how do we create ways to apprehend or invent to be able to see that invisible livelihood that flows through these beings? Mm-hmm. So breathing with the forests is third on the line of this inquiry that we are trying to overcome the plant blindness, being able to visualize this reciprocal relationship where how the very simple act of respiration, of cellular respiration, and the photosynthesis can connect us thousands of miles away to an individual tree. Not just an Amazon is an idea, but an individual tree that is upstairs, Kapinuri tree that you can see the full livelihood inside, the cardiovascular of the tree's inner systems, the phloem and xylem, the water and carbon that's flowing on both directions, creating these two-way highways, producing oxygen and water vapor that is larger than the body of water in the Amazon River itself. So these phenomena are a bunch of facts, but how can I feel with it? How can I resonate with that information? The simple act of breathing does many things. The two things. One is bringing you to the moment, to your body, and away from the daily worries and anxieties of the modern life, allowing you to probably remind yourself. I think remember. It's not like teaching. I think it's remembering this feeling of when I exhale, my every third or the fourth breath will be taken by a tree like this, and here I am sitting with you, and it's quite an intimate relationship. Imagine inhaling someone. I just inhaled someone, and then I just exhaled someone. So bringing that feeling to the installation environment and continuing with that feeling is probably the core of this. That's the journey, basically.
Mm. When you step upstairs and you walk along these magnificent screens, revealing these hidden connections and taking you into the Colombian rainforest and the Kapinuri tree, you really feel transported. And although there are obviously universal scientific truths about the way that those hidden networks function, you also feel very connected to place. And you mentioned that this experience grew from a trip in the Amazon in 2020. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that time there in the rainforest with this tree, and how your experience there in that place really grounded you in the exploration. Because so much of your work is this parallel between such an intimate place-based experience with this much more universal meta-level exploration. But place is incredibly important. This is a specific place in the Colombian rainforest. This is a place that is under threat. This is a unique being. And your experience there on the ground must have been very impactful. So I wonder if you could talk about that, and also maybe some of the artistic processes that went underway while you were there.
Sure. Before we went to the Amazon in 2020, this is January 2020, just before the global pandemic kicked off. So we came back from the Amazon after staying there 3 weeks. 3 days after we went into full lockdown, without knowing any of this, basically. So I spent the world's anxiety were building up. I spent those 20 days in the Amazon rainforest, completely oblivious to the reality of outside world. Before we went, obviously, we did an extensive research. So that rigorous research process is part of that, both learning and understanding the space before we even go there, and series of interviews to understand what to expect from an ecological point of view, where to find some of those trees, what are the indigenous people of Ticune people, where we were in the Colombian Amazon, predominantly the residents of the area and the stewards of the land for thousands of years, and how they build that relationship is building this very intellectual kind of, reading and talking and trying to understand and watching. That process comes first, and it builds up a series of expectations. And when you land, mosquitoes are horrible. That is this. I was expecting this lush, beautiful, spiritual journey. I'm like, get me out of here. This is horrible. It took. Well, it didn't get better actually. It was for 3 weeks. It was horrendous. But you still, you start to ignore it. And then in extreme harmony, I managed to get an interview with. I'm going to forget his name, a professor who coined the term biodiversity. Primarily researched Amazon, and I was trying to ask him, what are the readings, like when I'm in a patch of forest, what are the things that I need to look at to understand whether this part is healthy and living and doing all those things in its optimum place, and what are the things not? The best answer was, there's no straight answer. The complication of life in the Amazon is so profound. The amount of species in 10 by 10 square meter patch of forest is so dense and complex. Seriously, it's impossible to understand. So went there with this knowledge, but actually experienced it, because there's no way fully untangling how this big organism lives all together. I don't know if you've seen a single human cell's visualization. It looks like a theme park. It's a tiny city, the complexity of it. That complexity expanded into a forestscape, and plants growing on top of each other and on top of each other, and you are completely bamboozled by that. And Darwin, when he went to the Amazon 1833, I think, for the first time, talks about this the mixture of stillness and the cacophony of sound all at once, at the same time. But somehow, as you walk through the forest, you get these pockets of stillness, as if nothing happening around you. Extreme quietness, and then this big mosquito just interrupts it. And then you continue, and a blue morpho butterfly interrupts it. And there is this strange rhythm that you start breathing. The most interesting revelation was that idea of lushness. And I think this is a helpful thought, by the way. And I was listening an interview we did with Marlon Sheldrake a few years ago for another research project. He mentioned this this extreme harmony is a fetishized idea. This life just built on cooperation is a utopia. And you actually experience this there. And his example is a jazz band, where jazz band individuals might hate each other, and there are so many examples in the history, right?
Definitely, yeah.
Right? But when they're on stage, what they produce is just, soulfully moving everyone. A similar feeling when you go to the Amazon, everything is half-eaten. There is literally every leaf, every branch, everything is half-eaten. These insects just trying to take over the entire forest, and the forest is producing clever ways to push that back without even moving anywhere. And obviously that is the other part. So there is that reciprocal relationship among species. Sometimes certain species are dominating and becoming invasive, and some other times it's a perfect stillness, that things are a bit more lush. But fascinating thing is, we know maybe a tenth of the old species in the Amazon. So there's the idea of losing Amazon is not, I'm going to lose this tree that I know really well. All the things that are not even explored or known to...
The loss of the unknown.
It's such a profound thought. So I think this, realizing and experiencing that it was even more urgent, this feeling of we might lose the Amazon rainforest by the end of this century. That is a real projection. If the feedback effect, the self-forcing feedback happens, we might lose majority of it. So the reality of this complexity of life that can exist in such profound ways, both in harmony, cooperation, and competition, all presented in one place and embodied there, is extremely moving. So that was one of the biggest, I think, surprise, and being there just allowed me, to experience this in firsthand. And every work we are trying to bring a little bit of a chaos and that kind of level of complexity that is a little bit too difficult to untangle. And that's a deliberate act, obviously. On the other hand, I love the fact that we can actually simplify some of those things to ease that connection in the kind of visual manifestation or the sensory manifestation of the work. The process of obviously being there, the main purpose we went there to conduct a series of scanning missions. When I say scanning, actually capturing 3D information from the land, from the trees, using both cameras, taking series of photographs, and also using this thing called LiDAR scanner. It's an architectural tool. It shoots laser 700,000 times a minute, measuring constantly, creating this coherent, sub-millimeter accurate representation of the world there. And then conducting ecological survey, understanding what species are around us and how we can learn about them, and whether there's a pattern for us to talk about it afterwards. Conduct series of interviews with the indigenous leaders and the elders there to understand their cosmologies and their relationship with some of those species. Not to directly influence the work, but to understand how these profound links they build over, thousands of years can be read from a distance. How can we resonate with that feeling of being connected to land, to this tree, to this plant, this much? And then extensive sound recordings, field recordings using ambisonic microphones, which you can hear. You've got these individual recordings of certain birds, insects, hydrophones, which is underwater microphones, to get the suction sound of the trees, but also get the sound of the river, combining mosquitoes, butterflies. So individually recording hundreds of hours of recording, and then coming back to studio and untangling all this data, categorizing and reconstructing with some of the research we do both before and after. The invisible parts, the beyond the soil line, is an imaginary part of this work and this process as well. We talk to scientists looking at, they often research the drought management, and they call it water fluxus systems. So they study the root structures and how they grow per species and how they interact, which gives us a diagram of how these certain species establish their roots and what kind of entanglement happens and what species they favor to exist next to them and what species they don't. Some of them love epiphytes, some others don't, and just trying to understand that relationality and then build that in the studio to create the final work. And obviously one big artistic license we are using here is the rhythm of the tree. We can consider 2 pulses a day, 2 heartbeats a day. When the sun rises, this continuous act of spraying oxygen and water vapor and sequestrating carbon. And then when the evening comes, just, reducing the pressure within the body, dropping its, I want to say arms, dropping its branches down. And that's 2. And our, limited human perception obviously needs adjusted to 3 time in order to see these changes. Otherwise that single particle would take 8 hours to move from the bottom to top, and that might be a little bit of a boring artwork to give this vibrancy. So we are, trying to dial our perception into 3 time to see that vibrancy. And that kind of comes into this place.
Well, technology plays a huge part in your creative process, from the capturing and scanning and recording of these spaces that you visit and inform the work, and then back in the studio, where you take that information and you create these incredible immersive experiences. And I'm curious to ask you about the balance between the technology shaping and informing the vision, and the vision determining how you will use the technology. And also maybe a little bit more about how you take this data. You spoke about it a little bit, and you use it to resemble the forest so accurately. Making some changes to, as you said, increase the heartbeat, so it is something that you can actually experience not just twice a day, but in a constant form. But what is that balance there, and that creation of the data? Because you move beyond the experience of it being scientific and data-based, but it's so grounded in that. How do you transcend that?
Scientific data comes with a responsibility also. And we are artists, and we are not accountable to visualize the most accurate representation of a tree. And we are not even trying to do. But when you ground, there's this fascinating sensory motor fact where, a toddler can tell the difference whether a branch moving because of the wind or there's a species on it, like a tiger walking on it. So it's called mechanical and biological motion. And we've got this innate ability to observe and differentiate these things very, very early on. So our ability to understand moving things and assigning emotions to them is so innate. So there is something here. It's one of our tools, basically, our perception of motion, and how can we utilize that motion to represent some of those ideas. And that's where the split happens. Because for a scientist, probably you can't speed this up. Probably you can't have these oxygen moving that particular way. But assigning these properties, trying to create a visual poetry to resonate with that feeling allows us to use that artistic license and trusting the human ability to emotionally connect to a single moving dot in a very profound way. And it's really surprising, and it's a strange phenomenon. And that's kind of the defining line. So if we ground it in truth, innately we know where it's coming from. You may have heard the uncanny valley, where when we see a 3D model of a tree or a human, we can tell something is not right. Even with the most advanced technology today, still the creases and the edge of the eye gives it away, and you know it. And you don't need to know VFX, you don't need to know design, graphic design, or film even.
Right.
You can still tell it's not right. So that we've got this innate ability. So the more we ground it in truth or in science, the closer we get to evoke that sensation. And then from there, start using artistic license to a level where that realization, that connection bond stretches but never breaks. And that is a fluid process. So where it stops being scientific and where it stops being artistic is a very elasticated process that varies in every project. So that's kind of the decision process, and it is very iterative also because of the processes, and some of the real-time systems, building software systems to visualize those things, allows us to tweak these parameters on the go and see what actually creates the feeling trying to communicate. It's just, how do you create that feeling of tree pulsing with life and breathing with that rhythm, and just speeding up, slowing down, finding the right moment. And that's the finding the pigment moment, basically, like mixing the colors. And then technological decisions, obviously pretty much everything we do is aided by technology. And excites us so much. It allows us to play. How far we came with some of the technologies over the course of even the last 10 years.
Right.
From virtual reality to sensing technologies, and them being this accessible and broadly distributed wealth of information that we can, tap into on demand any given time is just incredible. But it never really starts with, oh, here is a virtual reality headset. Let's do something with it to create a project. It's often starting with an idea. What is it like to feel or see like a frog? That's the idea. Or do dolphins dream in sonar? So that work backwards. What is the ultimate medium for us to communicate this exploration? Okay, sonar, probably the bodily tactile feeling of echolocating is important. Then can we look at the haptic vests? It's these vests that are very popular for gamers, that it vibrates, and music producers also wear them, so you can actually feel this strong growling bass in your body on demand without disturbing all your neighbors. But also you can manipulate it. So so the thought drives to a few options of technologies, which we then combined in unexpected ways, often lots of gaffer tapes between them, and just mushing together and trying to create that emotional sensation. And obviously it fails, it changes, and it's a bit of a pain in the ass, and just like it updates all the time. But it is quite fascinating. The moment you think you mastered the specific medium of one generation of virtual reality headset with a specific resolution, it goes away. And that just keeps us on our toes to continuously understand and follow that, and evolve with it. And the work also evolves with it, because the ability of that technology defines how far we can push certain things. But it's never the other way around, that technology dictating what we have to do or what we should do.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Darwin and his description of the sound of the rainforest there, a mixture of stillness and the cacophony of the birds and the insects and the life that pervades it. And this experience, breathing with the forest, is a very, very potent, large-scale visual experience. But to me, it's almost just as much, sometimes even more so, an auditory one, a sonic one. There's 22 speakers in that room, guiding you on a journey and taking you into these processes that you're visualizing. And you mentioned you spend a lot of time recording these sounds, whether they're birds or frogs or even underwater with the hydrophones of the water moving up the tree. Tell me a little bit more about the process of creating this sonic landscape and how it's also connected perhaps to the breath and the pulse and the rhythms that you are inviting people to participate in.
I have to mention our wonderful collaborator, extremely talented composer, James Pulley, who was with us in the Amazon recording all those things, pretty much not sleeping, so he can catch the howling monkeys in the morning and then fireflies in the evening, gathering hundreds of hours of sounds in order to create that feeling. And so the spatial sound is quite interesting. Also, this multisensory world-building processes, where the sound has such profound effect on us. And there's this, psychoacoustic properties they call, when we hear thunder or a growling animal, it fills us with fear. This is innate. We all feel it in varying degrees, and it's all coming from the same place. And probably we can trace back to caveman and maybe even before. There's this emotional response out of control to certain sounds, and that's called psychoacoustic. And we've got these emotional responses to sound when we roll back to Lascaux and Chauvet, the two caves in France 37,000 years ago, where the first human artworks took place in the cavities of these very complex cave systems. But one fascinating fact was the way they found it was turning off their torches and walking down in dark paths and clapping. Wherever the echo of the cave just reverberates 5, 6, 7 folds, they turn on their torches, and it's the most complex painting that they found. And when we, come forward, the Orkney and Stonehenge, there's a strong belief that the structure erected to create a sensory stimuli, mainly sonically, and felt experience of drumming 60 BPM creates this resonant frequency that evokes or kind of induces a transcendental state. And when we come forward, I don't know if you've ever been to wonderful St. Paul's Christmas Mass. I mean, the sound reverberates through the space, and it's not coincidence that we find these emotionally moving places have a commonality in terms of how they play with sound, how they create sound. So sound is this important and so innate, and we can go back and forth in human story and find a moment that the sound was the most important thing and still is. So in that respect, we wanted to create a moment of darkness before revealing the visuals for this piece. And that was a deliberate act of trying to bring you to your breath, and beautifully prompted by the invigilators at the entrance. Just paying attention. It's a dark space also. You're walking from a brighter space into a darker space. It will take a while for your eyes to adjust. So you move slowly, naturally. And then as you move slowly, you slow down and you hear the breathing rhythm. The breathing rhythm is a combination of a baraka just spraying in a glass of water and some of the hydrophone recording. So there's a Foley work trying to evoke what would be the sensation to give you that 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out breathing rhythm. And hinting these moments, because it was very, very similar. Muchilera birds is the most polyphonic one. If you go upstairs, you'll recognize it's just the most incredible Nokia smartphone ringtone produced by a species, basically. That comes and goes every now and then. That gets interrupted by some of the parakeets. That gets interrupted by howling monkeys, and every now and then a mosquito flies by. And this is the stillness of the forest interrupted by these blips of sound, drawing your attention to different species and immersing you all around. So creating that feeling of, I'm not consuming content from a frontal plane like we do with most of the screens, but it's all around me to experience what is it like to be there in this sped up tree time.
In many of Marshmallow Laser Feast installations, and of course in Breathing with the Forest, you invite people to step into the processes, and you spoke about this briefly, photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and here in this experience, mycelial communication, that are unique to the trees that you have scanned, form the base of your work. And these processes translate the sensory perceptions of a different species. And in the case of Breathing with the Forest, the Kapanuri tree and the surrounding ecosystem. And this allows us to connect to these processes in a deeply experiential way, where, as we've been speaking about, a scientific process becomes a communicative one that invites you into a relationship with this different species outside of our own human-centric ways of being. Can you talk about the approach of translating these processes and creating these invitations that allow you to connect to another species?
The best example I found over time, obviously very much inspired by What Is It Like to Be a Bat, Thomas Nagel, 1973 paper. He made a huge stir and divided the entire scientific and philosophical realm to two. And he rightly said, we're never going to know. Unless you are born with the sensory features of a bat, you're never going to know. All you do is an interpretation of it. You can't even begin to understand. But we can try. And we can try. And obviously that was a provocative approach, and it did beautifully for us to ask these questions. Oh, wait, so other species experience reality differently? What do you mean? Like a tick? That small tick? lives reality 6 frames per second. A human lives a moment 25 to 30 frames a second, meaning everything for them is extremely slow. So when we switch these sensory perceptions, I mean, I'm sure there are moments you have it when you're in this wonderful connection and a dialogue with a friend. Time flies, 2 hours pass like 5 minutes. And then you're in this very, very packed central line trying to get to Hackney Wick. It's this like 25-minute journey becomes 5 hours. And this like, our perceptions kind of actually constantly doing this? If we can prompt it right, can we allow ourselves to embody other beings, other species, by playing with the plasticity of our perception, basically? And so this idea of disembodying your own body and embodying other species, mostly coming from there. There's a curious way of being other than human. Can we expand ourselves or begin to expand ourselves to experience life for a moment, or imagining for a moment being a tree, being a mosquito, being a frog? Obviously, the animate species are probably a little easier. There's a cognitive barrier. What is it like to feel like a tree? An oak tree. Kew Gardens made this wonderful website and research. An adult oak tree connects to 2,300 species any given time. 2,300 species live on or off it. So they are in this reciprocal relationship. How can you, and when you think about it, it's like, okay, how can I be in a relationship with 2,300 things any given time in this very intimate way? But actually, the moment we start looking into our microbiome, we've got enough microbes. We've got more microbes in our body than our cells. The amount of cells we've got in the body is less than the amount of microbes and bacteria that we have in our body. So we are this, multitudes of being constantly walking and doing things, thinking that that's an individual thought and it's me, but actually in conversation with everything in you. So the more we exercise this idea of we never just an individual, but also constantly enmesh with other beings with us, it allows us to kind of bridge that gap or ease the idea of disembodying your own body and embodying something else as becomes easier. So these pieces are trying to create the primers for us to have that leap for a way where you might be familiar with this idea of flow state. Gardeners go into it, mathematicians go into it. When we washing dishes, we go into it. Playing music, we go into it. Solving a hard problem, we go into this moment of singular focus. You're in a tunnel, you can't tell what time it is anymore, and your mind is absolutely in that very moment, and that's the flow state. But it's got primers, so you can prepare yourself to go into a flow state by adjusting your breathing, adjusting the light around you, by simply turning off the notifications, clearing the noise. It's not really that difficult to alter human psyche momentarily. So if we can do that, in a very scientific, methodical way and many practices, in many spirituality practices also practice
Based
this,
on
right?
this, yeah.
So how can we utilize some of those and modern science and spiritual practices in the primer and the embedded side of the artwork to allow the viewer, the participant, to be able to momentarily disembody their body and embody something else. And it's all coming from that constructed space, basically.
I find the work that you and your collective do to be deeply emotional. And when I'm upstairs, and when I've experienced your work in the past, I feel like I'm going through a multi-layered experience. There's awe, there's wonder, there's joy, there's discovery, there's connection, there's kinship, but there's also grief, for what can be lost. And there's also a feeling of humility, of feeling small and secondary. And I know all of us respond to work differently, and emotions are activated differently for each person in an immersive space like Breathing with the Forest. But I imagine in the creative process, you were thinking about all the different kinds of emotions that you want to evoke and that you want to invite people into. So I'd like to hear a little bit about this process, but I guess there's also a larger question there, which is, what is the role of immersive art and technology in creating empathy and kinship through the use of emotion?
Yeah. When we start talking about shifting landscapes and commissioning a new piece to exhibit together, one of the themes that, trees are migrating. They are walking away from us. So there is this aim to highlight the reciprocal relationship that we have trees as a primary kind of approach. But the secondary underlying theme of the piece is also kind of highlighting the idea of tree migration. So obviously your research gave us the prompt to look into that reality, not just for the very well-known tree migration that happens in Northern America, very well documented, some species moving 100 kilometers over the course of 10 years. It's like a decade, literally, not, uprooting and moving, but standing there. That sounds like a not Game of Thrones, the Lord of the Rings, but it is that image, right?
Yes.
So some species are moving, and the temperate rainforest species or temperate species, they can adapt to these changes. But the idea of tree migration for tropics is catastrophic. And through that prompt, obviously we went into a research process, found this magnificent research, and it is the most comprehensive and the only one published in 2018, primarily by University of Miami researchers and a biologist who was doing her PhD called Belen Fatigue. She went on a mission working with different scientific entities in Andes to kind of gather data over the course of a few years, looking at different patches of land. I think they've got almost 100 plots around Andes in different elevations. Andes is from a few hundred meters all the way to 3,000 meters, and looking at how species are moving. It's inconclusive in comparison to the studies of Northern America, where so in the interview I was asking, like, why we don't know about this? How come we know all the trees and how much they move in America, Northern America? How can we not know these things? This is such an important thing. And she was right. How many species were in that study? 86 species in Northern America. And this is, the biodiversity indicator. They have more than 2,000 species in those small patches, separate species.
Right.
So the complexity of life really makes it difficult for them to come up with a conclusive story. But what they know is some trees in the tropics are not used to cold, hot weather. So they can't really alternate. So they enjoy being in this very steady state of warmth or dry and wet seasons, but without huge shifts of temperature changes. As the temperature changes on a drastic way for a long time, they tend to send their offshoots to a further spot that is a bit cooler. So it's not as hot. And often they hit the mountain, the Andes, and they send it up and up and up, and they hit an ecotone block that these trees cannot exist any beyond. And they call it treetop mountaintop extinction. It's a really sad fact that knowing some species are walking away from us because of us to go and, disappear from a mountaintop. So this piece specifically moving away from us constantly. We are there sitting, watching as the time passes. breathing with it as we feel emotionally connected, but then it moves away from us, coming from that. So that was one of the I think the sorrow and some of the musical elements of the piece, especially like in music theory, when you put certain chords together, it is actually sad, and there's a deliberate act of feeling that connection. It is, yes, both celebratory of this incredible hidden animism, the livelihood, but also the idea of losing them one day, very, very soon. Just want to leave with that feeling of urgency, but also connection at the same time.
I want to go back to the breath. You've spoken about the breath throughout our conversation, because it's not just the title of the piece, but it's obviously a central theme, and a connective device and shared experience between the humans and the forest is present. And when we contemplate the relationship between our breath and the breathing forest, we encounter the question, and it's a question I think you've asking throughout your work, where does my body end and where does the world begin?
This is the part I go. I speak a lot about that 17 to 30,000 breaths a day we take in average, and a third to a quarter of it coming from the trees. So we are sharing breath. I mean, I'm sure you had these moments, being close to the loved one, feeling their breath, and enjoying that moment. This is happening at least 5,000 to 7,500 times a day with trees. So we've got this incredible invisible bond. And not that I feel it all the time, but, trying to prompt myself with this feeling of whenever I feel anxious or, alone, it's like, you're not alone, you're connected to a number of things right now with your breath, and it happens any given time. And, whether you practice this or not, if you're driving a car, you're already practicing expanding your sense of self to a larger body. If you are, driving a plane, it's even more crazier. And if you are driving a cruise ship, and imagine we've got this ability to expand our sense of self to include a cruise ship, why not a tree that you breathe with? I think that's the main thing we wanted to highlight this one.
You've also described this experience as an open-eyed meditation. What is the space that you want to take audiences in with this meditation? Is there a specific transformation that you'd like them to experience?
It really doesn't matter what happens in the gallery. Like, how you feel, what you take on from. But what would be wonderful if you walk out, and if you're especially walking towards the South Bank Center, there are trees immediately outside. If you can see a particle flowing around them, if you can see some of the animals in them, then I think that's all success. Just leaving with this feeling of connection, leaving with this emotional muscle memory of the livelihood that flows through trees and plants and all the living world around us. Having that feeling and a visual memory to it is probably all we want. And that the meditation, meditating with this idea, starting with a breathing meditation to be fully present in this place, sitting with this tree, allowing yourself to take in these visual sensory stimuli, sonic parts, and maybe the scent that we've got in the room. And then living with that feeling and looking at your houseplant and seeing some of it would be amazing.
Ersin, thank you so much. It's been lovely to be in conversation with you. And thank you for your work. Emergence magazine is an initiative of Calliopeia Foundation. Our original essays, in-depth interviews, films, and rich multimedia explore the threads connecting ecology, culture, and spirituality. Our theme music is composed by Logan Stalley and H. Scott Salinas. This podcast is edited by Erica Neiginger and produced by Shauna Quinn and Emmanuel Vaughn Lee, with writing by Lucy Warmald. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever podcasts are found. To subscribe to our newsletter, order our new print edition, and check out more of our stories, visit emergencemagazine.org.